When emergency became normal, at first it was justified by fear, then by necessity. Eventually, it stopped needing justification at all. What began as an exception slowly transformed into routine until emergency no longer felt urgent. It felt familiar. To understand why this shift matters, we must return to a Europe facing repeated shocks. Financial stress arrived faster than institutions could recover. Each crisis demanded immediate action. Temporary tools were introduced to stabilize markets, reassure investors, and buy time. The language was clear. These measures were extraordinary. They would not last. The first reveal appears in how often those tools were used. Emergency programs were extended, renewed, and quietly expanded. What had been designed for short-term containment became infrastructure for long-term management. Deadlines were pushed forward. Conditions softened. The word temporary remained, even as permanence took hold. The second beat followed as behavior adjusted. Markets stopped reacting to emergency measures as signals of distress. They began treating them as background conditions. Risk was priced with intervention assumed. Planning incorporated support as baseline rather than exception. The extraordinary blended into the ordinary without resistance. What made this transformation subtle was its logic. Each extension made sense in isolation. Ending support too early felt reckless. Maintaining it felt prudent. Over time, caution rewrote expectations. Emergency tools no longer disrupted normality. They defined it. By the time anyone asked whether emergency had become policy, the answer was already visible in behavior rather than law. Systems no longer waited for a crisis to justify intervention. They operated as if crisis were permanent. And once emergency becomes normal, the meaning of both words begins to change. As the reveal deepened, permanence began reshaping incentives across the system. Institutions adapted to an environment where support was always present. Risk models adjusted assumptions. Balance sheets expanded with confidence that backstops will remain. What was once insurance against disaster became part of everyday calculation. The conflict emerged when dependence replaced preparedness. Emergency tools reduced urgency to address underlying weakness. Structural reform slowed. Difficult choices were postponed. Why endure short-term pain if stabilization could be extended again? Emergency measures did not remove risk. They relocated it into the future, where it was easier to ignore. The buildup intensified as boundaries blurred. New crises were assessed not on severity, but on whether they justified continuing existing programs. Emergency lost its meaning as a trigger. It became a setting. Policymakers no longer asked when to exit, but how to operate within permanent intervention. Markets responded rationally. If support was always present, absence became the real shock. Even minor hints of withdrawal triggered outsized reactions. Normality inverted. Intervention calmed nerves. Restraint provoked fear. The system no longer trusted itself without assistance. Public perception shifted unevenly. Stability endured, yet anxiety lingered. People sensed the difference between resilience and dependence. Emergency measures protected outcomes, but they also flattened accountability. Success was measured by avoidance of collapse rather than progress. Survival became the benchmark. By this stage, the paradox was clear. Emergency tools had worked too well. They had prevented disaster repeatedly. But in doing so, they had redefined what normal looked like. Crisis no longer demanded change. It demanded continuation. And a system that cannot imagine life beyond emergency begins to forget how to stand on its own. The tension peaked when the cost of permanence became impossible to ignore. Growth slowed despite constant support. Productivity lagged behind expectation. Innovation hesitated in an environment where failure was cushioned but success was capped. Emergency had stabilized the floor, but it had also lowered the ceiling. The conflict sharpened as policymakers faced a dilemma of their own creation. Withdrawing support risked shock. Maintaining it risked stagnation. Each option carried political and financial cost. Emergency tools, once flexible, now felt heavy. Designed to move quickly, They resisted reversal. The longer they stayed, the harder exit became. The buildup intensified during moments of relative calm. With no immediate crisis, the justification for intervention weakened. Yet markets had grown accustomed to presence. Signals of normalization triggered volatility. Silence was interpreted as threat. Emergency measures had inverted expectations. Stability depended on continuation, not confidence. Inside institutions, concern grew. Analysts warned that constant intervention distorted signals meant to guide investment and risk. Price discovery dulled. Misallocation accumulated. What emergency had protected in the short term now undermined adaptability in the long term. The system was safe, but increasingly unresponsive. Public debate struggled to keep pace. Emergency, by definition, discouraged reflection. Questioning it felt dangerous. Yet citizens sensed something off. If everything required emergency support, what did normal even mean? The language of crisis had become permanent, leaving no space for vision beyond containment. By now, the realization was unavoidable. Emergency had stopped being a response. It had become an environment. An environment shaped behavior far more powerfully than rules ever could. The turning point arrived when policymakers reframed the question. Instead of asking how long emergency could continue, they asked what emergency had replaced. The answer was uncomfortable. Emergency had taken the place of confidence, adaptation, and long-term planning. It had become a substitute, not a bridge. The climax unfolded as exit strategies were finally named rather than avoided. Timelines were introduced. Conditions clarified. Emergency measures were reclassified as transitional, with explicit endpoints. The goal was not sudden withdrawal, but restoration of meaning. Emergency would once again signal exception, not baseline. The resolution followed unevenly. Some measures ended smoothly. Others required recalibration. Markets reacted sharply at first, then adjusted. What mattered was not the absence of support, but the return of predictability. Knowing when help would end allowed systems to prepare rather than guess. Confidence began rebuilding on structure rather than assumption. What endured from this chapter was a lesson learned through repetition. Emergency saves systems when used sparingly. Used constantly, it weakens them by erasing contrast. Crisis management cannot replace governance indefinitely. Stability requires more than survival. It requires the ability to imagine life beyond rescue. Europe did not reject emergency tools. It reclaimed their meaning. And in doing so, it remembered that normality is not the absence of danger, but the presence of choice. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. When